Have you tried translating Chinese to your native language as a learning method? You should. It has more benefits than you might realize. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about translation as a learning method, and more specifically, we're going to talk about translating from Chinese to your native language. This month, we have a translation challenge on Hacking Chinese starting on August 10th and lasting until the end of the month. To get you started with that and give you some ideas of what you might do during this challenge, I want to spend this episode talking about translating from Chinese to your native language, something that I think is overlooked normally and something that many people deliberately stay away from. But as we shall see, I think there are some serious benefits with translating from Chinese to your native language instead of the opposite, which is much more common in classrooms and courses. To learn more about the challenge, check the link in the description or go to challenges.hackingchinese.com. And that's also where you should go if you listen to this in the future and want to join a challenge. Joining is completely free, and when you enroll in a challenge, you also set a number of hours you aim for the duration of the challenge. And then you can track progress, interact with other people in the challenge, and see if you're able to reach your goal. This month's challenge is about translation, and that includes both directions, so either from your native language to Chinese or from Chinese to your native language, or some other language you happen to also speak. You can also expand this to interpretation and include that type of practice as well. It's important to note that what we're talking about here is translating and interpreting for the purpose of learning the language. So the goal with these activities is not necessarily to produce the best translations, but rather to further your Chinese in various ways. Naturally, being good at translation can be useful in itself. I mean, one of the reasons we learn a language might be that we want to understand something said or written in the language and then be able to relate that to somebody else who doesn't speak or read the language. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this as a learning method. This might seem a little bit backward, at least in a timeline sense, because it used to be that language education was mostly about translating from the target language to your native language, usually called the grammar translation method. So you use this to study the grammar, to study the vocabulary of the target language, and the output was then in your native language. This method doesn't work very well if your goal is to communicate in everyday situations in the language you're studying, of course, which is why this method has been largely abandoned. For example, here in Sweden, it used to be the case that there was quite a bit of emphasis on being able to compare different languages, so the foreign language you studied with Swedish in this case, and also that it was fine to check if somebody could read a language by asking them to translate to Swedish. While being able to translate is useful, it comes with a number of problems, because it doesn't really focus on the target language itself, and like I said, you can be very good at translating without being able to use the language, and what we're after these days is communicative ability, not translation skills. This can also be problematic in contexts where there are many students who simply don't speak the same language. This is particularly true if you learn Chinese in a Chinese-speaking environment, because there simply might not be a language that everybody understands, and so checking everything by, say, translating to English might not be a possibility. So why is it then that I want to talk about translating from Chinese to your native language in this episode? Well, because I think it is a great learning method. It is not something you should do all the time. It is maybe not even something you should do very often, but we only have it on Hacking Chinese challenges once a year, so spending a few weeks doing some translation will only do you good. Many of the things that I will talk about in this episode comes from a guest article written by Julian Lair many years ago, and I will put a link to that in the description. But this is rather my take on what he wrote, plus some of my own thoughts, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I want to acknowledge that the structure and the general approach here is taken from his guest post. If you want to know more about Julian, you can check out episode 50, where we discussed his PhD dissertation about a digital ecosystem for learning Chinese. And as usual, I'll put links to these things in the show notes. The main benefit of translation is that it is a very active form of reading. And just like with any other kind of input, you can vary the intensity of what you're doing. So there's a very big difference between reading something casually, where only getting the gist is enough, such as if you're reading the subtitles of a movie you're watching, and translating a short story from Chinese to your native language. In the first case, you will probably understand what's going on even if you don't know every single word. You might not even need to read all the words because you can still hear what people are saying in the movie, and you can also rely on what's shown on screen to figure out what it means. So the likelihood is that this type of reading is much more superficial and more casual compared to if you're asked to produce a text in your native language corresponding to source material in Chinese. For example, I often encourage students to read as much as possible and not necessarily care about all the small details, because usually it isn't worth spending all your time with your nose in a dictionary to figure out exactly why someone said something or why someone wrote something. But if you never do this, you can also end up with hazy notions of how some words are used or indeed what they mean. However, if I ask you to write a translation, you have to resolve these ambiguities. You need to really know what the difference between word A and word B is, and what this expression actually means, and a good way of expressing it in your native language. Now, the bit about expressing something in your native language won't necessarily improve your Chinese as such, but resolving these ambiguities and really understanding what something means so you can then figure out how to say it in your native language certainly improves your reading ability. Even if the goal of translation here is not to produce the perfect text in your native language, translating at all usually requires you to dwell on sentences, read them more than once, and maybe also edit your translation later, meaning that you will get to read the same text very closely several times, and this is, of course, great for recycling vocabulary, reviewing what you've learned earlier, seeing these sentences being used, the grammar, and so on. When you are editing your own translation, you also think very closely about the meaning and the usages of words in context, and this is never a bad thing. Another advantage, and this depends a little bit on what type of text you are translating, is that you learn to express things that Chinese people write about in your native language. So this could be culturally significant things in China or in Chinese history or Chinese culture, and so being able to express these things and talk about them in your native language has an extra value, maybe as a bridge between cultures. And if you're interested in this, you should definitely check out Julian Lair's The Marco Polo Project, which is at least partly about connecting cultures through translation. And as usual, I'll put a link in the show notes. So let's turn to some practical matters, such as how to translate and what to translate. The first thing I want to discuss is the difficulty of the passage that you are translating. And since we're doing this for the purpose of practicing our language skills, it doesn't really matter what you translate from that perspective. It doesn't have to be something in classical Chinese, it doesn't have to be something imbued with cultural significance, and so on. It could just be something simple that you found interesting and want to express in your native language. However, I do agree with what Julian says in the article, which is that you shouldn't only take the easy way out and say choose graded readers or your textbook or something like that, because one of the advantages of doing translation to your native language is that you can actually express quite a lot in your native language, and it's obviously much easier to read about something and understand it in a language than it is to express the same thing yourself. Also, since your goal with translating here is not to earn money or finish an assignment or anything like that, nothing says you have to translate everything. Julian suggests that you skip anything that seems too hard, even if it's a whole paragraph, and it doesn't really matter because, again, the goal is to practice, it is not to produce a perfect text in your native language. This is good advice for writing practice in general, even if it's writing in your native language without translation being involved, or if you're translating to Chinese or just writing in Chinese directly. And the advice is, of course, to not care too much about quality when you start. Just write. It's probably going to be quite bad whatever you do, and there is no point in wasting time trying to make it perfect from the start. Once you have finished the whole text, you can go back and try to improve quality, and this is what I referred to earlier as editing your translation. Naturally, you're not going to hand this in or not necessarily even show it to anybody else, so it doesn't matter if you just leave it after this first fairly sloppy translation. That is still a useful activity. However, like I also said before, editing can be very useful. It encourages you to read the text closely over and over and compare what you have written to make sure that it means the same thing and that it has the same tone and so on. There are also some extra challenges that comes with translating from Chinese to your native language, and I'm assuming that your native language is an Indo-European one, such as English here. For example, Chinese doesn't have tenses, it doesn't have gender, it doesn't have articles, it usually doesn't use plurals either, but it's not the case that this information is just lost in Chinese, but rather that it is implied by context, and this requires you as a reader to read the text very closely to disentangle these things and write a text that works in your native language. And then when you edit, you also need to make sure, did you choose the right tense? And which article is the best to use here? Is it the unicorn walked into the bar or a unicorn walked into the bar? As you can see, translating to your native language requires you to spend an awful lot of time thinking about the text in Chinese in great detail. And like I said before, this is something we rarely do. If you want to give this a try, there are also many tools you can rely on. And in his original article, Julian used Google Translate and showed how you can use that to great effect to facilitate translation and to make sure that you can deal with text that might otherwise be rather difficult. Since then, we have also seen the advent of large language models such as ChatGPT that can also aid you in your translation. As the name implies, these models are based on huge amounts of language, and as such, they are fairly good at translating. I haven't made a systematic comparison between, say, ChatGPT and Google Translate, but I can say that I have been fairly impressed by ChatGPT's ability to translate from Chinese to English. Using chatbots also has the advantage that you can ask them questions about the translation. You can ask them to translate, you can ask them to compare your translation with their translation, and you can ask about specific words. Why is this word suitable here and this one, which I used, is not? You are of course not going to get perfectly reliable answers, but when it comes to language accuracy, the large language models do quite well. Julian also suggests that you use machine translation on different levels. So you can, for example, input a whole paragraph and see what the result is, and this of course works for ChatGPT as well. But you can also do this sentence by sentence or even phrase by phrase if there is something in particular you found difficult or want to explore further. I don't think it's a good idea to use machine translation first and then try to check the translation to see if it's good, because in most cases it actually is quite good and there won't be that much left for you. Back in the good old days when machine translation was very bad, this used to be a good teaching opportunity actually, because you could show students a translation from one language to another and then ask them to spot errors and try to figure out what went wrong and why. But nowadays, the mistakes they make are so rare that it doesn't really make much sense to do this. Instead, I suggest you try on your own first. And you don't need to write the whole text, you just need to do a few sentences if you want, and then you check what the machine translation says and try to compare the two and figure out if you could have done better. This is a common activity in translation courses where several different people or different groups of people are given the same text to translate, and so you will end up with many different versions that you can then compare and see which one has the best translation for a certain passage, and you can in the end arrive at what you think is the best translation. As I've said a few times now, the goal here is not to produce the best translation, but by comparing different translations, you are actually learning quite a lot, and that is the point. You can use this type of activity even if you're not in a course, naturally. You just need a few friends and you agree on translating the same text, and then you sit down and discuss and compare afterwards. If you're a teacher, you can also arrange for your students to do this now and this works equally well in the other direction, so if you're translating to Chinese from the student's native language. If you're interested in that, you should check out the Beginner's Guide to Chinese Translation, and here I refer to Chinese as the target language, not the source language, as we have discussed in this episode so far. If you prefer to listen, that was the focus of episode 61. And like I said, this type of translation works equally well for the challenge. I think that's enough about how and why translation can be helpful for learning Chinese. And if you want to have a go yourself, the challenge starts on August 10th, so enroll and I'll see you there. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.